the Ottoman Empire around 1600. More and stronger enemies at the doorstep necessitated an expansion of the military. Inflation and rising prices strangled the economy. This was the empire's situation between 1550 and 1650, and the administrators had only one answer: spend, spend and spend more. Revenue had to come in from somewhere. What is every government's solution to everything? Exactly, more taxes. Surely, spending other people's money will work out just fine. The Sultan's powers were to be used totally, at his discretion. A decision of the Grand Imperial Council, declared by a firman in the name of the Sultan, was able to raise the extraordinary taxes of the Divan, or the common law taxes, each time there was a need. Because of the ease with which it was levied, this method of taxation, truly an exception at the beginning of the 16th century, had become customary by the century's end. It can be considered the beginning of modern taxation in Turkey. Raising taxes might have provided some liquidity in the beginning, but in the end it turned out to have some unintended consequences. The Sultan attempted to rectify the situation through the heavy-handed approach of simply creating new taxes, resulting in crippling inflation and large-scale flight to urban centers. Further naive economic responses by the government merely exacerbated the situation, leading many soldiers and peasants to resort to brigandage merely to survive. Since the levying of new taxes on the population proved to be a catastrophe, other ways of taxation had to be found. Luckily, there was a lot of land available, farmed by a class which had lost most of its military worth. It was up to the provincial Sipahis to pay the bill, although inflation had hit the Sipahis very hard. Under this system, the Sipahis were often the most market-oriented members of the rural communities they lived in, as they had to convert to cash most of the tax revenues they collected in kind, and then spend them on the training and the equipment of the soldiers. The evolution of the monetary economy and the long inflation had already produced a financial crisis in these military fiefs. The revenues of the Timariots, composed of medieval rights and privileges, were not able to respond to the necessary costs of modern armament and the increased costs of living. One way to solve this problem was obvious. Let most of the Sipahis stay at home, since they were not needed anyway, and have them pay a fee instead. The consequences of these developments for provincial administration was that the traditional arrangements gradually became obsolete. The revenue grant system was not abandoned until the 19th century, and in some cases at least the provincial cavalry continued to attend campaigns. But at times when the Sultan's central treasury needed cash infusion, they were asked for money rather than service. This was done for the first time around 1650. Let us think through this process. Instead of being a soldier, the Sipahis took up a new role. Now they were more like taxmen, gathering the revenue meant for them and passing it on to the central government. The same held for the higher levels of the administration. The new-style provincial governors had different functions in different situations. In an interior province, the governor was to raise cash revenues and transmit them to the center. Such a governor was now styled as supervisor of revenues and placed above the provincial treasurer, the traditional agent of the Sultan, and all other revenue collectors and tax farmers. Forgive my sarcasm here, but I have to ask this question. What could possibly go wrong when hiring a taxman? Already in the late 16th century, a guy named Mustafa Ali had an answer for us. He complained that candidates would not hesitate to pay the treasury 40,000 gold pieces to be appointed a revenue supervising governor in an important province such as Baghdad when the official allocation was much less, because they knew they could make a lot more for themselves. Changing the administration from soldiers to taxmen was not enough to satisfy the never-ending greed of the central government. Therefore, the Ottoman administrators stopped to hand out some timers and used them otherwise instead. The government tried to close the gap between state revenue and state expenditure by levying new taxes on the peasant population, and a system of tax farming, whereby an individual or partnership paid the state in advance a sum equivalent to the tax revenue from a given source, then made the actual collection themselves, with an extra element of profit built in, was extended. The new system was efficient in that, pushed by competition, the farmers bid against each other and raised the prices of farms. They of course had to recoup the losses from their renters. In fact, once in possession of the farms, they arranged the extortion of every possible profit. This is very similar to the European system of selling benefices. The incentive for this system is clear. Everyone's intention is to maximize the yield of one's investment. For a tax farmer who has bought his land for a limited time, this means plundering the bought office and/or land as much and quickly as possible. It would be the task of the landlord to set boundaries to this intention. As the private owner, the landlord wants to keep the earnings running. In our case, the landlord was the Sultan, who did not care very much for the economic use of resources. His interests were power and conquest. The Ottoman government handed out benefices as privileges to their cronies. Even the administrators could not ignore this development and had to change the rules a little bit. Another feature of ad hoc reforms during the war years was the financial institution of lifetime tax farms. Being aware that short-term tax farmers tended to recoup the purchase price and maximize their profits in a year or two, the hope was that a long-term, indeed lifetime tax farmer would have an interest in the productive potential of the revenue source and the prosperity of the peasants. These contracts simply stayed with the same tax farmers at the same fixed value for decades, indicating that the auctions ceased to be competitive in these cases. The official records show that these frozen tax farms were controlled mostly by the members of the bureaucracy, although it is likely that they entered partnership agreements in the financing and/or actual collection of the tax revenues. In many instances, these insiders at the capital sold the tax farm contracts to subcontractors after the initial auction. So the result of this reform was only that powerful officials and officers were able to lock in their gains for lifetime. Barkan refers to such landholders as farmer generals and describes another functions they fulfilled. On the other hand, the farmer general, by paying in advance a large part of the debts to the state, acted as a kind of credit agency in a country where the lack of public credit institution was severely felt. Let's put together what we learned about the effect of the changes in taxation. Originally, there were two powerful military groups in the Ottoman Empire. On the one hand, there were the Sultan's household troops. A lot of these were Janissaries. On the other hand, there was the provincial cavalry, the Sipahis. From an economic perspective, both groups were heavily affected by the inflation of the 16th and 17th century. The household troops received, apart from plunder, a fixed income which lost a lot of purchasing power with rising prices. In contrast, the Sipahis received land grants. The revenue of these fiefs was supposed to be used for military equipment, but the things necessary for a cavalryman became more expensive too. Now, we have two armed forces, both desperate to make up for the financial losses. One of these two groups has an important military function, the other gradually lost all military value. Guess what happened? Exactly. The Janissaries, infantrymen with firearms, were irreplaceable from a military perspective. This shifted the balance of power against the Sipahis, mounted archers. It is no wonder that Janissary officers or farmer generals took over parts of the land which earlier were controlled by the Sipahis. There still were Sipahis, but many now had the function of taxmen. The Janissaries still were soldiers. An officer might have earned some riches this way, but taking over Sipahi land also included some other kind of satisfaction. Around 1600 there still were deaf chemise in the corps, and you might remember that they had to spend the first years of their training in Anatolia, working for farmers, or in other words, Sipahis. A Janissary officer had good chances to be a winner in the 16th and 17th century, but for an ordinary Janissary the situation was much gloomier, and it became worse. The Ottoman treasury faced high expenditures while price increases ate up their revenue. Something had to be done, but attempts to improve trade failed. Raising taxes was a devastating idea, so the administrators came up with the most ingenious solution of all. It was a very cunning plan. We have seen that the Ottoman Empire, caught up in the current of a great international inflation, tried ineffectually to counter its difficulties with devaluation. Devaluation, however, led to even greater dislocation in prices, and the empire was dragged from one financial crisis to another, unable to move against the strong current that held it. Devaluation means debasement. This is done by lowering the content of precious metals in coins and replacing it with cheaper metals. In the end, government planners' cunning plan backfired tremendously. From a modern perspective, this is not a big surprise. Devaluation is expansion of the money supply, and therefore is the exact same thing that was the source of the overall problem. To be fair, one has to admit that there was no economics theory present through which the Ottomans could have recognized what it did. In the end, whoever decided on the path of inflation did not learn anything from the experiences, because it was tried again and again. A large part of the overall decline in the silver content of the Akçe and the Kurus occurred during three periods. The reign of Mehmed II during the second half of the 15th century, the period of fiscal and monetary instability from the 1580s to the 1640s, and I'm not going to tell you about the third occasion, but trust me, we'll find out. By doing that, in the 1580s, homemade debasement created a massive wave of inflation that was so powerful that it even made the copper coins useless. The Istanbul Mint thus began to strike the new Mankur in December 1688. The minting of copper coins provided the state with substantial seigniorage during the 32 months this experiment lasted. The net revenues of the Mangi experiment thus accounted for approximately 12% of all receipts of the imperial treasury during the same 32 months period. At the bottom of the Ottoman monetary hierarchy was the copper coinage, which exchanged not at or close to its intrinsic values, but at nominal values fixed by the state in fractions of the akçe. The mangyr was quite useful and minted in large quantities until the second half of the 16th century. After the debasement of 1585, when Ottoman prices more than doubled, fractions of the akçe simply became too low to remain useful in most daily transactions. In an earlier episode, we talked about inflation, which was imported from the Americas. Here, the Ottomans did it to themselves. Which influence was stronger, you may ask? Well, here we have prices measured in silver according to Özmozur. You can easily see that the prices nearly doubled in the observed 200 years. But this was only the prices measured in silver. Through this we can find out about the price inflation affected by the increased quantity of monetary metals. Now let's look at the prices in akçes, the Ottoman currency. By this we can also see the effect of debasement on the prices. And here are the prices again, but this time measured in silver. We can easily see both lines moving relatively parallel until 1570, around the time of the big debasements. Suddenly, the increases in terms of silver do not seem so catastrophic anymore, do they? Doubling the prices in 1 century is still bad, but not as bad as maybe even an 8-fold increase. Nevertheless, according to Brodberry, in comparison to Europe the price increase was relatively small. Here's the conclusion by Pamuk. The preliminary result of an ongoing study on prices in Istanbul and to a lesser extent in other leading cities of the empire from the 15th to the 20th century show that in the long term debasements or the reduction of the specie content of coinage by the monetary authorities were the most important cause of Ottoman price increases. Therefore, the Ottoman government mostly produced the problem all by itself. But the inflation at the end of the 16th century was not the only one. Before that, there were two major drives for debasement by the Ottoman government. In the charts we have already seen an immense increase in the prices at the end of the 17th century. But there was another one around 1440. Let's look more closely into this devaluation. From the first accession of Mehmed II until his death in 1481, however, the weight and silver content of the Ottoman unit was reduced 6 times. These dates indicate that after the first and second accession of Mehmed II, the government followed a policy of one debasement every 10 years in the Islamic calendar. Towards the end of his reign, the intervals were shortened to 5 and 6 years. Pamuk even presents data on Mehmed II's debasements. While shortly before 1450 the silver content of an akçe was a little bit more than 1 gram, it continuously declined until around 1480, when there were only 0.7 grams left. This is an increase in the money supply of 30%. Now to the big question: why was this done? The regularity of the debasements suggests, however, that they were not necessarily undertaken when the state had urgent needs and had exhausted other sources of revenue. Instead, debasements were turned into a regular levy and were undertaken even when the treasury had ample reserves or when the financial needs were not urgent. The very large volume of the reserves confirms that debasements were not driven by fiscal emergencies but were used to build a powerful treasury. Nevertheless, I would guess that there was some financial need involved too. Mehmed II was the Sultan who conquered Constantinople. It could very well be that he needed the financial reserves for the siege and for setting up his court after the occupation, but this is only speculation and I do not have data on this. In addition, if you remember the video about the Janissaries training, a Janissary to be earned only half of a fully trained Janissary, that is 1 akçe instead of 2. It was Mehmed II who started renting out young devshemis to farmers and increased the numbers in the training units. I argued that his actions could be connected to problems in paying the Janissaries. We can support this theory by looking at a chart we already know very well. As you can see, both periods of debasement coincide with a vast expansion of the numbers of the Janissaries. It could very well be that the Sultan raised money in order to spend it on his household troops. The other way is also plausible. Out of military necessity, the Ottomans had to raise the numbers of the Janissaries and found the means to finance this in inflating the currency. The reaction of the Janissaries to the debasements supports this theory. In both periods of debasement, people in general were, a little unhappy. Finkel tells us about the Janissaries' reaction, who expected to get their pay in sound money after the debasement of 1589. Such a drastic inflation of prices exacerbated social discontent to the point where the authorities found it impossible to force people to accept payment of their salaries in the debased coinage. Because taxes were paid largely in aspers, treasury revenues were also halved in real terms. The same held for the Janissaries. They showed the disaffection clearly. By 1589, the adverse effects of the debasement of the asper produced a Janissary revolt like that which had erupted in response of Mehmed II's manipulation of the currency during his first sultanate in the 1440s. Yes, the homemade inflation caused full-blown revolts. We will have an episode dedicated to revolts overall, so we will not delve deeper into this topic here. In the end, the Ottoman administration found out the hard way that inflation was only a solution in the short term. With the notable exception of the reign of Mehmed II, the Ottoman governments pursued a policy of stable money and stayed away from debasements until the second half of the 16th century. Even though debasements offered short-term fiscal gains to the state, their political costs remained equally clear. Whether the Janissaries revolted or not, it changed little about the fact that they faced financial difficulties. This allows us to look at the opening of positions in the Janissary Corps to the wider population from a different perspective. Following the debasement of 1585, those on fixed salaries paid in aspers, such as members of the bureaucracy or the military, suffered greatly, for the money now bought only half as many goods as before. Naturally, the Janissaries tried to mitigate the cut in their purchasing power. The government did not pay them enough, so they had to find other means to earn a living. Why should they not put their skills to use in peacetime and only return to the army in wartime? This thought is one of the basic arguments for establishing conscript militias. Historians traced back Janissary involvement in trades and crafts in urban centers as early as the late 16th century. They argued that with the deprecation of Janissaries' daily pay, many of the Janissaries thought to enter crafts and trades in order to protect the standards of living. Suna adds here that this led to mobilization problems, starting with the end of the 16th century, but I think this is a mistake and he probably meant the end of the 17th century. In the end, the date does not matter. The conscript idea backfired. We'll hear more about this in future videos. Letting the Janissaries become tradesmen was an attempt to enable them to earn their own living. Other changes were not only about monetary value. As everyone who has a job knows, working conditions do matter. Therefore, this sheds new light on the changes in the rules of the Janissary Corps in the late 16th century. Allowing the soldiers to marry and the acceptance of the sons in the corps was an attempt of paying the Janissaries without the need to expend money immediately. The administration tried to add further benefits. In fact, the government long realized the problem, and in addition to the regular salaries, provided the Janissaries with an annual clothing allowance, plus set up a special fund to subsidize the Janissaries' purchase of staple commodities, such as bread and meat. Such subsidies, along with revenues from transgression fees, artisanal activities and trade, as well as the availability of credit from the Corps Fund, were important incentives for commoners aspiring to enter the Corps. Not Janissaries were traders, but also had their old benefits. One of them was tax exemption. Of course, this privilege was in high demand. Realizing Istanbul's need for infantry troops, the Janissaries themselves seized the moment and used it to enlist their sons and relatives into the Corps. Selling Janissary certificates, that is, entry tickets to the Corps, became a lucrative business for Janissary officers. It is not a big surprise that selling positions in the Corps, or in other words, corruption, became a common way to make up for the lost income. That Janissaries turned to civilian occupations was not limited to Istanbul. Janissaries had to be stationed on the countryside for multiple reasons. The introduction of tax farming put a lot of pressure on the peasants. They had to pay up to 50% of their yield. The farmer generals threw them out of the farms and masses of unemployed came to the cities. At the same time, the Ottomans turned to hiring fighters for single campaigns, simply because it was cheaper. For the unemployed, this always was an option. They became soldiers whenever needed and turned bandit when nobody took them into pay. In addition, after Selim and Bayezid fought out who would follow Suleiman on the throne, Bayezid's defeated soldiers roamed the countryside. Janissaries were sent out to bring them under control. Agostin describes this as follows. Settled in the countryside as guardians, these Janissaries supplemented their salaries by collecting fees for transgression, a function and privilege traditionally belonging to the provincial cavalry, and by establishing businesses in towns and acquiring farmlands in villages. This development was enhanced by changes in garrison practices. In addition to the rise in the numbers of Janissaries serving in the provinces and frontier regions, the temporary rotational service system was also changed in the meantime. At the end of the century, most of them were serving in the same province permanently and had already established family and socio-economic relations with the local society. In doing so, they became part of local politics and power struggles, much like their predecessors had in Istanbul and Egypt. Whatever the merits of this policy in the short and middle term, the Janissaries who were assigned to provinces permanently lost their military value and became more or less a police force. This civilization of the Janissaries had massive impacts on the military value of them. Therefore, it is hardly surprising that only a portion of the Janissaries recorded on the pay sheets participated in campaigns. In 1597 about 26%, and in the second half of the 17th century between 25 and 33% of the total. How many of these pseudo-Janissaries managed to add their names to the official pay lists is unknown, but the practice was the first sign of the massive civilianization of the Janissary Corps, and it also further worsened the already existing lawlessness and disorder in the countryside. And this is a good place to stop and take a look at what we learned today. Two kinds of troops made up the bulk of the Ottoman military. On the one hand, there was the household troops, mostly Janissaries. On the other hand, there was the provincial cavalry, the Sipahis. Both institutions faced big challenges from the 16th century onwards. First and foremost, inflation. While the Janissaries, whose military importance increased, developed from elite soldiers into militia tradesmen serving only when needed, the Sipahis lost their importance and many even their land. Influential men took over the lands as farmer generals. Among them were Janissaries. The Janissaries continued to receive payments, rations, housing, exemptions from taxes and other benefits. Because of the tax-exempted status, they became intertwined with guilds. They made sure to keep the privileges. If necessary, they even used violence. In the end, the Janissaries as an institution infiltrated nearly every aspect of the Ottoman Empire. In earlier times, they had directed their energy to expansion. When this failed, they resorted to aggression inside the empire. Someone had to be plundered. And now it is your turn again. Can you come up with an idea to solve the financial problems the Ottomans had without handing the Janissaries too much power? Tell me in the comments. Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe. So long, we'll meet again soon. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free.